The gallery opening was everything Marcus had promised it would be, all champagne flutes catching the light from crystal chandeliers and women in dresses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, their laughter echoing off the white walls where abstract paintings hung like windows into wealthy minds, and I stood there in my simple black dress from 3 seasons ago, the one I'd carefully steamed that morning to hide the slight wear along the hem, feeling every eye in the room assess and dismiss me in the same breath. Marcus was already 20 feet away, his hand resting possessively on the elbow of Catherine Whitmore, the gallery owner's wife, his head thrown back in that practiced laugh he reserved for people he wanted to impress, and I watched him the way you watch a stranger performing a role you used to believe was real, remembering when that laugh had been genuine, when it had been meant for me. My champagne glass was empty, but I didn't move toward the bar because that would mean crossing the floor alone, and I'd learned in these 3 years of marriage that being alone at these events was worse than being invisible. It was being visible in all the wrong ways. A woman without an anchor in a sea of couples who'd known each other since boarding school and summer houses in the Hamptons. Rebecca Thornton was the first to approach, her smile sharp as the diamond tennis bracelet circling her wrist, her eyes traveling from my outdated clutch to my department store heels with the efficiency of an appraiser cataloging items for auction. She said something about how brave I was to wear last season's styles, how refreshing it was to see someone so unbothered by fashion, and the women around her made soft agreeing sounds that felt like wasps building a nest in my chest. I smiled because that's what you do. You smile and nod and pretend the poison isn't taking effect. Pretend you don't notice how they formed a circle that's really a wall, how their bodies angle away from you even as they're speaking to you, how every word is designed to remind you that you're playing a game whose rules were written long before you arrived and which you'll never fully understand. Marcus glanced over once, caught my eye for a fraction of a second, and looked away with an expression I'd seen him use when a waiter brought the wrong wine, a flicker of disappointment followed by practiced indifference, and something in my chest that had been cracking for months finally split clean through. The evening wore on in that particular way wealthy events do, where time seems to move differently because everyone's pretending they have infinite amounts of it, where conversations drift from vacation homes in Tuscany to which charity gala has the best silent auction, and I found myself near the catering table, which is where the invisible people always congregate, the ones who serve and the ones who don't quite belong. And I was reaching for a canopy when I heard Marcus's voice rising above. The general murmur with that projection he used when he wanted everyone to hear. He was telling the story of how we met, except it wasn't really our story, it was his version, the one where I'd been working as a receptionist at his father's law firm, where I'd been so clearly out of my depth in that world of legal briefs and client meetings, where he'd taken pity on this sweet but rather clueless girl who didn't understand the difference between a retainer and a deposition, and the group around him was laughing, actually laughing at his affectionate mockery. And I stood there with a tiny phyllo cup in my hand, feeling my face burn with something beyond embarrassment, something closer to rage. Catherine Whitmore touched his arm and said something I couldn't hear but could read in the sympathetic tilt of her head, something about how generous he was to be so patient, and Marcus shrugged in that false modest way of his and said clearly, loudly, that some people just aren't cut out for this world, that it takes a certain background to really understand art and culture and the responsibilities that come with real wealth. And everyone you marry can't help where they come from even if they try very hard to fit in. The room didn't exactly go silent, but there was a shift, a collective awareness that something had been said that crossed a line even in a crowd comfortable with casual cruelty, and faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to barely concealed satisfaction at being witness to someone else's humiliation. I set down my champagne glass on the nearest surface, and maybe I set it down harder than intended because the sharp click of crystal on marble seemed to echo, and I walked across that polished floor toward my husband with my heart hammering but my step steady, and the crowd parted because people always make room for disaster. They can smell it coming and they want a front row seat. I stopped directly in front of Marcus, close enough to see the slight widening of his eyes, the first hint of uncertainty crossing his face as he registered something in my expression he hadn't seen before. And I said in a voice that carried beautifully in that acoustically perfect space that it was interesting he should mention my background, since tomorrow morning at 10 we had an appointment with both our attorneys for the reading of my grandmother's will. The confusion on his face was genuine, that at least was real, because I'd never spoken much about my grandmother except to say she'd raised me and that she'd passed 6 months ago, and he'd never asked for details because he'd never really been interested in anything about my life that preceded him. I continued in that same clear, calm voice that my grandmother had been Helen Ashford Chen, and I watched the name land like a stone in water, sending ripples of recognition through the crowd, because even people who didn't follow business news knew that name, knew about the textile empire built over 4 decades, the real estate holdings spanning 3 continents, the art collection that had museums sending representatives to beg for loans. And Marcus's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion giving way to disbelief, giving way to something that might have been horror. I explained to the room, to these people who'd spent the evening reminding me I didn't belong, that my grandmother had believed in earning your place in the world, that she'd made me promise to live independently for 5 years after college before I could access anything beyond a modest trust, that she'd wanted me to know who I was outside the weight of her fortune. And that tomorrow at 10 o'clock the waiting period would officially end and I'd be assuming control of assets currently valued at approximately $1.3 billion. The silence that followed was the kind that feels solid, that presses against your eardrums, and I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, at this man I'd loved enough to marry, this man who'd spent 3 years treating me like a redemption project, like a fixer-upper he'd generously taken on, and I told him that I wouldn't be attending tomorrow's appointment. That my attorney would be filing divorce papers simultaneously with the will reading, and that he should expect to hear from them about the prenuptial agreement he'd insisted on, the one that had seemed so important to him, the one that protected his family's money from me, the one that very clearly stated that in the event of divorce each party retained only the assets they'd brought into the marriage. Rebecca Thornton made a small sound, something between a gasp and a laugh, and Catherine Whitmore's hand had fallen from Marcus's arm, and I could see him trying to calculate, trying to process, trying to find some way to reframe this situation in his favor the way he'd reframed everything else, but there was no angle here, no spin that would work. Because the numbers were real and the timeline was real, and tomorrow morning everything would become official and documented and completely beyond his reach. Someone's phone buzzed, and then another, and then several at once, because of course someone had already started searching, had already found the Forbes article from 2 years ago about Helen Ashford Chen's succession plans, had already found my name listed as sole heir, and I could see the information spreading through the room like wildfire. Could see the recalculation happening on face after face as they realized they'd spent the evening mocking someone who could buy the gallery we were standing in without checking her bank balance, who could commission pieces from any artist in this room, who could fund museums and foundations and make or break social careers with a single decision about where to direct her philanthropic attention. Marcus found his voice finally, said my name like a question, like a plea, like he was trying to summon back the version of me who would have accepted his explanation, who would have smoothed this over, who would have made herself smaller to make him feel bigger, and I looked at him with something close to pity because I could see him understanding, perhaps for the first time, that he'd had something real and thrown it away because he'd been too shallow to see past his own assumptions, too cruel to treat with kindness what he'd believed was beneath him. I told him I'd be staying at the plaza until I found a suitable apartment, that movers would collect my things from his house tomorrow afternoon, that he should direct all future communication through my attorney Michael Brennan at Whitfield Brennan and Associates, and I said that name deliberately because even Marcus, for all his pretensions, would recognize one of the most expensive and ruthless family law firms in the city, and his face went pale as the full reality of his situation became clear. Catherine Whitmore was already moving toward me, her entire demeanor transformed, her smile now warm and genuine, and she was saying something about how she'd always known there was something special about me, how she'd told Marcus he was lucky to have found me, and I cut through her revisionist history with a polite request for my coat because I was leaving, and she practically ran to fetch it herself. And the crowd parted again, but this time it was different. This time there was deference in the way they moved, respect, the kind of space people make for someone who matters. Rebecca Thornton tried to catch my eye, her expression now eager, friendly, all traces of her earlier condescension erased, and I looked through her the way she'd looked through me an hour ago, and I saw her register the cut, saw her understand that there would be consequences to this evening beyond what happened between Marcus and me. That social circles have long memories, especially when it comes to who was cruel to whom before the hierarchy was clear, and I felt nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, just a kind of exhausted relief that I no longer had to pretend any of this mattered. The coat check girl brought my jacket, the Goodwill one I'd kept from before the marriage, from when I'd been living on my modest trust and my receptionist's salary, and I tipped her $100 because she'd been kind to me earlier when she'd noticed my outdated clutch and complimented it anyway, and her eyes went wide with gratitude, and I thought about how strange it was that the people with the least were often the most generous, the most willing to see you as human rather than as a rung on a ladder to be climbed or an obstacle to be removed. Outside the gallery, the November air was cold and clean, and the city stretched out before me full of possibility, full of life beyond these cramped circles of inherited wealth and manufactured status, and I stood on the sidewalk breathing in the smell of roasting chestnuts from a vendor's cart and car exhaust, and that particular scent of New York in autumn, and I felt lighter than I had in years. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. My phone buzzed with texts, first from Marcus, a stream of messages ranging from angry to pleading to calculating, and I blocked his number without reading past the first few words, then from numbers I didn't recognize, people from the party who'd somehow gotten my contact information, and I turned my phone off completely because I was done with all of it, done with performing. Done with trying to earn acceptance from people who viewed kindness as weakness and cruelty as sophistication. A taxi pulled up and I climbed in and gave the driver the address of the plaza, and he caught my eye in the rearview mirror and asked if I was all right, and the genuine concern in his voice, this stranger's basic human decency, made my eyes burn with tears I wouldn't let fall, and I told him I was better than I'd been in a long time, and it was true. Tomorrow there would be meetings with attorneys and financial advisors. There would be decisions to be made about foundations and investments and how to honor my grandmother's legacy while building my own. There would be interviews and articles and probably another wave of people suddenly interested in being my friend. But tonight there was just the city lights streaming past the taxi window, just the knowledge that I was free, just the future spreading out before me undefined and terrifying and entirely mine to shape however I chose. And somewhere in a gallery downtown my husband was learning what it cost to mistake quietness for weakness, to confuse kindness with ignorance, to believe that worth could be measured by the season of someone's dress or the neighborhood where they grew up, and I hoped that lesson would serve him well in whatever came next, though I doubted it would, because some people never learn that the cruelest thing you can do is underestimate someone who loves you, never understand that dismissal is a violence all its own, never grasp that the stories we tell about other people say far more about us than about them. The headlines started appearing before I'd even finished my coffee the next morning, my grandmother's name linked with mine across financial websites and society pages, and by noon there were 3 voicemails from Marcus using words like misunderstanding and hasty decisions, his voice taking on that wounded tone he'd perfected over the years, the one that used to make me apologize even when I'd done nothing wrong. My attorney called at 1:15 to confirm the divorce papers had been filed and that Marcus's lawyer had already requested a meeting to discuss the prenuptial agreement, apparently hoping to find some loophole, some way to argue that my inheritance constituted marital property despite the clear language we'd both signed. And Michael's dry amusement came through the phone as he assured me their position had no legal merit whatsoever, that Marcus would walk away with exactly what he'd brought into the marriage, which was considerably less than he'd anticipated walking away with when he'd insisted on that ironclad prenup 3 years ago. By evening my phone had 47 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize and invitations to 5 different charity galas that hadn't wanted me on their guest lists last month, and I sat in my hotel room watching the sun set over Central Park thinking about my grandmother, about how she'd understood something about human nature that I'd been too young and too in love to see. About how she'd given me the gift of knowing exactly who cared about me and who cared about what I could do for them, and I wished I could thank her for that clarity even as I mourned the innocence I'd lost along the way. Marcus showed up at the plaza that night, talked his way past the front desk with whatever story he concocted, and when the knock came at my door I looked through the peephole at his face, at the man I'd promised forever to, and I felt nothing but a distant curiosity about who I'd been when I believed his performance was real, and I didn't open the door, just called through it that he should leave, that we had nothing to discuss outside the presence of our attorneys, and I listened to him stand there for almost 5 minutes before finally walking away, his footsteps fading down the carpeted hallway like the end of a song I'd once known all the words to.